Enoch smiled down from the mast of the great ship that he was at the wheel of. He had made a good decision putting Daniel Gregg and Carolyn Muir together. Although they had been separated by 100 years, the two people truly belonged together. The process started with the meeting of Bobby Muir, the father of Jonathan Ad Candy. He had been in heaven working on his garden when Enoch had spoken to him. Bobby loved Carolyn and wanted no part of stopping her chance for happiness. He had been surprised of the news that Carolyn was in love with a man who had lived so long had been missing in their marriage. Carolyn had always been kind and gentle, but the fire just had never been there. He knew that if she belonged with him they would be reunited, but this was her and his children's chance to be happy, and he had agreed to the plan. With Bobby Muir's okay, Enoch had been sure that the captain would be happy to have a chance to live his life with Carolyn in this century. He had been observing the household at Gull Cottage for some time, and although Daniel had been a rough captain, there had never been any doubt in his mind that there had been some kind of time glitch and that the two people belonged in the same time. The two were taking long walks on the beach together, and the house was being prepared once more for the holidays. The smell of Christmas was in the air. Martha was one of the best cooks around, and Captain Gregg had grown very fond of her as he had come to love the rest of the family that now resided in his home that he loved so much, named Gull Cottage. With Carolyn at his side, Daniel had felt that time seemed to stand still. All his life he had been a man of the sea. He had had many loves but had never met such a lady. Carolyn was smart, strong-willed, but beautiful and kind. She was a talented writer and a wonderful mother. For the first time in many years, when you entered the home of Gull Cottage, I felt as though you were walking into a home, not just a house. But the summer had been a wonderful one. There had been the centennial where the captain had competed and won all of the contests. Captain Gregg had never felt close to his cousin, as he considered Claymore to be a frightened sloth. But with the guidance of Carolyn it did appear that there was hope and they could somehow overcome their differences. Claymore came by with some of the legal work that would need to be finished in order for Carolyn to have the rightful deed to the property. Daniel and Carolyn spent a lot of time on the beach and enjoying the sea air. There were presents and her parents' and husband's parents that would need to be told. But with everything, love was in the air, and guess what? Daniel was a great writer also. He was great with both of the children and took more of the responsibilities of a father every day. Jonathan and Candy wanted him to adopt them. Carolyn had been so excited about the proposal. But Daniel had so few local friends. Claymore and Daniel were always butting heads. Claymore was a very different man from Daniel. He was stingy where the captain was generous, and he was mouthy where the captain was more of a masculine man. But Carolyn needed to make sure that the two of them could get together long enough to enjoy the wedding. It was her hope that Daniel would ask his cousin to serve as his best man. Daniel had gone home to his temporary settings and couldn't help but smile to himself. With the quickness of a pouncing cat, she had convinced him to ask Claymore to be his best man at the wedding. Deep in his own heart he knew that this was the right thing to do, but he had considered having no one stand with him. But now he was to have his cousin stand by his side, and he was sure that things would work out all right. To Daniel and Carolyn's surprise, it turned out that Claymore had not been such a bad choice to serve as Daniel's best man. He went right to work and did the paperwork that would make things much easier for them with the ownership of Gull Cottage, and he had done all the work at no chair, a rare thing for Claymore. He had come to Gull Cottage and explained everything to Carolyn, who had signed all the necessary papers to ensure a good life. Finally, Daniel was living back on land. Every day he missed the sea, but he was now a man of 38, and it was time that he took on a life as a father and a husband. He loved waking on the beach with Carolyn and just staying outside in the good fresh sea air. Once in a while the Dikins got to him and he would tease Carolyn by acting as though he wasn't listening to her, but that was never the case, and he could see by her actions that she could see right through him. Today was the day that Carolyn was to start making the plans for her new life. It was a time of great happiness, but she was a little reflective. This time the wedding was going to be small, but she would have her children, her parents and Bobby's parents there. When she and Bobby had married, that had eloped. It was not until much later that she had learned how much her thoughtlessness had hurt her parents. There would be Ed, who was Martha's friend, and Claymore, but that would be it. They were to have a small ceremony at a lovely restaurant at the inn in town. Emily and Brad Williams were looking forward to meeting the man who had caught their daughter's heart. Carolyn was their only child. She was a wonderful woman and had made them proud. They were both sure that Captain Gregg was going to be a good man. She seemed so happy and cheerful, it was good for them to hear the news. When she had moved to Maine just a year ago, they had worried about her life there. They would be arriving along with Bobby's parents 3 days before the wedding, and Emily hoped that they would have plenty of time to get to know the man who would soon become their son-in-law. She thought that it was sweet of him to offer them his home in which to stay. She knew that Carolyn's home was full and would be very busy with the wedding plans. At first she had been a little disappointed, but she understood and was happy to now have perhaps even more time with this man who was going to soon be joining her family. Jonathan and Candy were both excited about their mom and Captain Gregg. They both called him by that name as it seemed the proper way to address the man who had come into their lives shortly after moving to Gull Cottage. He was so kind to them and they each loved to do things with him. They went fishing, swimming, and learned so many different things from him. Many times they would have their dinner with their new friend and he would come in and wish them good night. Once in a while they would go into town as a family and the people welcomed them as a family from almost the day Captain Gregg had come into town. Even the school teacher accepted him as he came to the school many times to pick Candy and Jonathan up when their mom was busy. Carolyn's passion had always been her writing. She worked hard at her typewriter every day, putting out different articles for magazines that now stretched to almost every state in the country, with even some stretching into the European countries. Nothing could have made happier than the discovery that not only did she love this man Daniel passionately, but the fact that he was an excellent writer and often worked alongside of her was just another piece to the love puzzle. Day after day Carolyn and Daniel worked together and the love grew. The smell of the ocean filled their nostrils and the sound of the waves beating against the rocks was so soothing. The combination of the two and the constant tapping of the typewriter made for a relaxing, loving mood that could not be denied. Although everything was not perfect, it was a life that Carolyn would not change for anything in the world. Carolyn had found herself laughing gently, thinking about how old-fashioned Daniel could be at times. She was thinking about the time that he and Jonathan had decided that it was time to get her something as a surprise gift. They had gone into town to buy Carolyn a present for the centennial. They came back with a flower-topped parasol. It was just so out of the normal wear, and she at first was not sure that she really wanted to wear it, but it had turned out to be the oddest but proper thing to wear during the celebration. She kept it hanging on her dresser and smiled at it every once in a while. After all, Jonathan had said that they had originally thought about getting her a new pair of boots. Candy was interested in finding more feminine things for her mom and Captain Gregg. She had gone up to what the captain called the wheel room, but she thought it as the attic and started to look around for something that her mom might like. Up in the attic she had found an old trunk. She had found that unfortunately it was locked and was looking for the key when Captain Gregg and Jonathan had come in. Jonathan and the captain were carrying an umbrella of some sort and seemed to be very excited about the gift. Isyy had looked at it and tried to be excited for them. She knew that Captain Gregg loved her mother and thought that she was going to love the present. "Captain Gregg, I would like to get Mom something too. Do you know where the key to this trunk is?" On the wall next to the trunk were the keys, and with a little difficulty the captain opened the trunk up. It was strange, but he had the feeling that this trunk belonged to him. But that was not possible. It had been there for years and had belonged to the original Captain Gregg, his namesake, some 100 years ago. But in the trunk Candy found a piece of scrimshaw. She wanted to give it to her mother, and it was decided they would give her the presents after supper that night. But Daniel had been working on his own piece of poetry for Carolyn. He hoped that he would be able to read the poem that he was working on their wedding night. He had thought about doing it during the wedding, but they had made the decision to keep the wedding traditional with the traditional vows. No, he wanted this to be a private poem, something special for her and her only. Of course, if she wanted to share it with someone, that would be her choice. He worked hard in the quiet and privacy of the wheel room while Carolyn worked hard at her desk downstairs. It was a quiet place and he had Scruffy for company. He shook his head at disgust as Scruffy yawned as he tried to read it to him. Scruffy had even turned his head and headed out the door when he was given a chance. Captain Gregg read over the poem and was satisfied with it. "What does a dog know anyways?" the grumbled to himself. He just managed to finish the poem and put it into the trunk when he heard the soft steps of Carolyn as she came into the room. Together they went downstairs and went into the living room. There were things to do as couples find out when there are plans that will change their lives significantly for the rest of their years. These were going to be hearty but happy discussions. Martha was in the kitchen cooking and left the couple to their privacy. She too was pleased with this new man that had come to be a staple at Gull Cottage. It seemed as though they were already a family. Many years had been spent roaming the globe as a seaman. Captain Gregg had gone from port to port and had many women, but now he had no interest but in Carolyn. He found himself in shock that he was now the future father of 2 children. Each night he read Jonathan and Candy before bedtime and said their prayers and tucked them in. He found himself feeling like a dad. Daniel enjoyed telling many of his stories of his time at sea, and the children would sit there mesmerized for many hours. But this was time for sleep, and he now girl making an attempt at making the story a much gentler sort. He had a long time ago learned that he could tell both stories to Candy and Jonathan. Candy was not a sissy of a gore, she was a girl from the 60s and able to take his stories in stride. As a matter of fact, as the older child, many times she encouraged him to carry on with the story. She reminded him of her mother with the same golden hair and the kind face. Now was time for the subject that he wanted to discuss with Carolyn. It was to be a tough subject, but he felt as though he needed to discuss it now. As he was rising from the bed on which Jonathan was sleeping, the door to the bedroom opened and Carolyn entered the room. She was proud of the way Daniel watched her children. He was a good, kind man with the best of intentions, she was sure. However, his language was sometimes what she would consider a little salty for such young ears. She tried to admonish him but felt herself give in to the man's charm once again. With that, the 2 lovers went down into the living room to once more work on a story. Daniel's writing skills and outlooks did clash with Carolyn's, but for the most part they worked well together, and the stories that they put out had been well received in many literary circles. Every day was like a holiday as long as Carolyn and Daniel were together. There were the family togetherness, including a birthday party for each of the children and a surprise party for Daniel. He had never celebrated his birthday and enjoyed the moment. But one of Carolyn and Daniel's times together were the quiet moments spent in the wheelhouse and enjoying Madeira together. It was a time where they would both dress up and try to get some free time away from the stress of everyday living. They would meet once a week for a leisurely time. However, it was nearly impossible to do with a family of 6, 2 young children, a housekeeper and dog. Also, it seemed that no matter what time or day they made their plans, something happened. One time the roof started leaking, another time a friend's car wouldn't start, but all in all things did finally work out for them. Every couple's faces challenges, and the challenge for Captain Gregg and Carolyn came when the tree in front of Gull Cottage began to constantly bang against the front window and actually broke a pane one evening. Carolyn found herself in the dubious position of someone who was going to have it cut down. She called a tree surgeon and had it removed. This angered Daniel more than she had ever seen. He was inconsolable. This tree had been brought from the Orient by the original owner and builder of the home. Daniel stayed away for a few days until Carolyn actually went to Boston, bought a new monkey puzzle tree and planted it in the center of the yard. They did make up and moved on. It was the worst few days for either of them. Daniel, forever trying to think of how to let Carolyn know that he had forgiven her, sent her a bunch of fresh flowers. She was glad to see them and knew for sure from that point on that things were back to okay. Now it was time for her to start dreaming about her wedding once again. She was dreaming of her dress. She pictured it to be lavender and nice. She did not feel right to wear white because she had been married before, so she would chose a light-colored dress. She dreamed of her and Daniel dancing the night away on the lawn of Gull Cottage, and of how it once was while she and Daniel enjoyed the front, though it was another time and place. Carolyn had always been a sensible person, but somehow there were times that she felt Daniel and the family would slip back into the time that the first Captain Gregg had lived there. She had thought about mentioning it to Daniel but had kept her tongue. To Daniel's dismay, he found himself going back to what he thought of as his temporary home. As he took a seat at the kitchen table, he thought about the wedding that he soon would be in. He had always thought of himself as a confirmed bachelor, and now he couldn't imagine himself without Carolyn and his family. He thought of how he wanted to dress for the wedding. He would wear his dress uniform and they would dance as though it was a ball from another time with friends on the front lawn of Gull Cottage. There would be their customary walk on the beach that day also. He liked the old-fashioned way of doing things as he had always been that way. The days were going by quickly and their wedding day was getting closer and closer. There were many days of hard work with both of them writing for different agencies every day, times alone enjoying Madeira, and gone were the bad memories of the day that Carolyn had cut down the monkey puzzle tree. Gull Cottage had been painted by the captain, the kitchen had been upgraded by Martha's friend Ed, and the flowers were blooming thanks to Carolyn's yard work. The sea was calm and the weather was getting warmer. Soon the wedding date would be here. The date had been decided. They would be married on the 29th of July in the middle of the warm summer. Once again Daniel wanted to approach a subject that he knew would be a tender one. But, it was something that he wanted more than anything. One night after everyone had gone to be in the living room, Captain Greg approached Carolyn with the question. "Honey, I have something to discuss with you. I do not impose to claim to be the biological father of your children, but I would be honored if they would be allowed to join you in taking my name." This was a complete surprise and honor to Carolyn. Her children had been fatherless since the death of her husband. Candy barely remembered him, and as Jonathan had been just 2 years old when he died, had no memory of him. Daniel had become the father that they had ever known, and she very much wanted them to be a member of the new family. She had hopes that she and Daniel would someday have a child together, and she wanted them all to be a member of the same family. Carolyn looked up at the man she loved and with tears welling her eyes said that she thought it would be a wonderful idea. "I love you so much," and she kissed him gently. "Now all I need to do is tell Bobby's mother and father. They must be told. I do have one question though." Daniel looked into Carolyn's eyes and smiled, his heart melting. "Yes? I would like to add the last name Greg to their name and let them keep the middle name Muir. Is that all right with you?" she asked. Daniel smiled at her and just shook his head. "Yes. Tomorrow morning we will discuss this with the children, okay?" Carolyn asked. With that Daniel took her in his arms and kissed her passionately. Candy and Jonathan were surprised to see Captain Greg at the breakfast table that morning. But today they were going to be trying on their clothes for the wedding, and although Jonathan did not look forward to it, Candy thought it was fun. Daniel and Carolyn smiled as Martha and the children showed off their fancy wedding clothes. There would be another fitting before the wedding, but for the most parts all of them looked good. Once the clothes fitting was finished, Jonathan and Candy were asked to come into the living room. As they sat there with the captain and their mother, they knew that something was up. Their mother smiled down at them and said, "Captain Greg has asked my permission to have him to adopt you. We would like you to add the name Greg to your name." Candy and Jonathan jumped for joy. This was the best news they could hope for. Once again, this is where Claymore proved to be a great help. As the town clerk, he helped Daniel and Carolyn fill out the necessary paperwork to make the adoption of Candy and Jonathan a reality. He came to the house and explained everything to them. There he had Martha witness the papers, and the adoption was now in the works. Carly took the information very seriously, as did Martha. But as for Carolyn, she knew that she needed to once more let Bobby's parents know what was going on. She had to be kind and gentle about it, but firm. This was her family, and the children would keep the name Muir for future family memories. It was a good solution to a difficult problem. She wanted everyone to be happy and to do what she felt was the best for her growing family. While Carolyn was busy with Claymore, she had felt it was better if the children were not there. Candy had a play date with her friend, and Jonathan and Daniel had left to do some shopping. Carolyn took a deep breath. She laughed to herself as she thought of the last time her son and the man that she had fallen in love with had gone shopping. They had come home with not the pair of boots that Daniel had first thought of, but an old-fashioned parasol. With any luck this time she would get a box of chocolates or flowers that Daniel was so fond of giving her. Jonathan was a normal 6-year-old boy and had no idea what she would like. He worshipped the captain and would do anything with him. They had become very close. But she would have preferred that they had gone fishing rather than shopping. She knew that since they had left walking they were not going very far, and so the shopping would be very limited in the small seaside town of Schooner Bay, unfortunately. But finally the weather was good, the sun was shining, the new clothes had been fit, and both parents had arrived in town. Everyone had worked hard to make sure that everything went well, and it did. The flowers were beautiful, and even Claymore wore a tuxedo. The wedding was small, as Carolyn and Daniel had wanted. The minister made the ceremony small but unique, and soon life at Gull Cottage would become as it should have been.